Let's take a look at the first question you'll be asked on your Cold War question paper. In this, you will be asked to explain one consequence of an event. So, for example, here you've got to explain one consequence of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you'll then be asked to explain one consequence of another event. So you've got to explain one consequence of the Cuban Missile Crisis and explain one consequence of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, 1979. Now, crucially, remembering consequences just means what happens after. It just means what happened after. So these consequences, or this consequence, can be good or bad. And you've got two 4-mark questions here. So this total for this question is 8 marks. So you're going to be spending around 5 minutes on each section, so around 10 minutes in total. So let's get into how to answer the question. Now, crucially, you are being asked to explain the consequence of the event. You are not being asked to write specifically about that event. The mistake people make on this question is that they will just talk about, for example here, the Cuban Missile Crisis. You're not being asked to do that. You're being asked to say what happened as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you're going to start it by going straight into the consequence. What happened after? Give a consequence of the question focus. So you start with this. One consequence of the question focus, so for this one would be the Cuban Missile Crisis, was that, and name the consequence. Okay, so you start it with one consequence of, because now there's no way you're going to write about the event because you've started it by saying one consequence of whatever your question is about. Was that, and just remember here, do not mention tensions yet. Keep that in your back pocket for your final sentence for your conclusion of this question. Okay, when I say conclusion, I mean your final sentence, wrapping it up. So then you're going to move on to the context. How or why did this consequence happen? Support your opening statement with extra details of what happened with the consequence you already identified. So just go into some more detail about that consequence. You're going to say one consequence of it was this. This was because, and just go into the context of the time. Okay, continue with this was because, and then finally you're going to explain, and here you're just going to reiterate the consequence that you've identified and the impact of it. And what I mean by that is explain what impact or what effect the consequence had on relations. So you're going to conclude it with something along the lines of this led to, or this resulted in, or the impact of this was. So it's give the consequence, explain in more detail what that consequence was, and then explain the impact of it on relations. Okay, so for example, you have been asked to explain one consequence of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So straight away, I'm going to start that by saying one consequence of the Cuban Missile Crisis was that a hotline was set up between the USA and the Soviet Union. Remember, I'm not going to talk about the events of the Cuban Missile Crisis because I'm being asked what happened as a result of it. So I'm just going straight into the consequence. One consequence of the Cuban Missile Crisis was that a hotline was set up between the USA and the Soviet Union. And then I'm going to say, why did that happen? What's the context of this? This was because both countries had recognized the dangers of brinksmanship and how it could lead to mutually assured destruction. So the hotline was set up so that the leaders could contact each other directly in order to diffuse future emerging conflict. And now I want to finish this with a conclusion about, or a final sentence to sum up what the impact of this was on the relations. Did the relations get better or worse between the two? So then I'm going to say the impact of this was a reduction in Cold War tensions, which was built on during the 1960s with the Outer Space Treaty and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So I'm just going to say, as a result of this consequence, as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis, relations actually got better because they recognised the dangers of brinksmanship, and now we have a cooperative atmosphere. And you want to sum it up there. So one consequence of it was, explain that consequence, and then talk about its impact on the relation between the two countries. So let's have a look at it again with a different question. So first of all, you want to start by saying the consequence. What happened? So give a consequence of the question focus. Remember, don't describe the question focus. Don't describe the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. You're just going to tell me what happened as a result of it. So don't mention tensions yet. Keep that in your back pocket. So start with one consequence of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was that it began a period known as the Second World War. So that's my consequence there, isn't it? It began a period known as the Second Cold War. And now I'm going to explain what the Second Cold War was in more detail, aren't I? So I'm going to give the context, how and why. Support your opening statement with details of what happened. So give more detail, give more context about the consequence that I have already mentioned. So I said it began the Second Cold War. Now I'm going to talk about what the Second Cold War was. So this was because America saw it as the Soviets trying to spread communism beyond its borders. Reagan had been elected, promising to be more confrontational with communism, and therefore America responded to the Soviet invasion by arming the Mujahideen to resist the Soviet Union. So I said it began a Second Cold War, and I said why and how, what did that Second Cold War look like? And now, to finish, I'm going to summarize with what the impact of all this was on relations. Did the relations get better or worse? And I'm going to do that by saying something on the lines of this led to, or this resulted in, or the impact of this was, and I'm going to go and say this resulted in increased Cold War tensions and return to previous hostilities, marking the end of détente. Okay, so you want to pick a consequence, explain that consequence in more detail, that same consequence in more detail, referring to the context, and then summarize it at the end by stating the impact of it, of that consequence on relations. Did things get better or worse? Or did the relationship between the countries get better or worse? Did it increase tensions or reduce tensions?